I'm going to do something different. I'm not going to use any technology except for the mic. Here's the question I got faced with this past spring. What do you do when you've got 3 dozen, roughly, faculty members, and you want to try to get them to understand and consider IBL-type approaches with students when none of them have ever heard of it before, basically, and none of them are mathematicians? That actually occurred to me, for me, through the Academy for Inquiry-Based Learning. There's a Visitors Bureau on that, and I think there's 15 or so of us, including a couple people in this room, in addition to myself, who are on that list. And that website was evidently discovered by people who run the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Technology at Murray State in Kentucky. And I think they probably didn't realize that all of us were mathematicians. I discovered about 3 weeks prior to doing the workshop out there that there weren't going to be any mathematicians there, and I asked for who was going to be there and got this long list of various kinds of disciplines. In addition to being no mathematicians, there was only one scientist, and that was a biologist. So I had this dilemma of how do you talk about and work with people to let them understand what we're trying to accomplish in mathematics when they're not mathematicians, all of my experience being mainly there. What I decided would work, maybe, and we all know that everything we do is a maybe, is to, first of all, do it IBL style. That is to go with questions. I had several years ago been invited down here to a You Teach luncheon and use that kind of format. At that time I had mathematicians and scientists. And so I had a set of questions that led that way that were already there, and I needed to just think about those in terms of people who were not mathematicians and scientists. What I thought would happen would be that responses to those questions, some of those questions, would point out the differences between the IBL approach and other kinds of approaches. And indeed, that did happen. And so what I'd like to do today is just to share a few examples of what did happen in that day-long, 2-session, day-long workshop at Murray State. Not the first question I asked, but one of the early ones that really led to what I felt like was a very productive discussion was, I asked them, I said, what is your starting point when you begin to plan a course? And waited for a response. Anybody guess what their responses were?
I know what I would do as a traditional teacher.
Yeah, all right.
Start with the test.
Okay. That actually wasn't what they said. That's right. It was all a matter of what am I going to cover? Which leads naturally for us in a distinction to what I think of as the process versus content question. And we talked about that. And I tried to get them to understand and ask them what is more important, the content or the process to get to the content. There were a couple of things that came out of that, and the participants came up with this. This is not my question. One of the things that I suggested to them was that which has been presented to them, the content, and they also talked about delivering the content to the students, which is sort of alien to what we do. I asked the question then, how long does that last? And I'll come back to that a little bit later. And they understood what I was saying in terms of what stays with the students and what doesn't. In the afternoon session of that, I tried, without good success, to use some examples out of what I try to do when I teach elementary statistics. I basically had some sets of questions that I have that are in my notes for that and that I use with the students. And I asked them, and 2/3 of them admitted they'd had a statistics course. No one in there could answer the questions that I asked, which made the point in terms of how long it lasts. And some of these people were fairly young, and some of them used statistics in their disciplines. The other question, and this is the question that they came up with and asked, and it is, can or will students fill in additional content for themselves if content is not your focus? Now, what we're trying to do with our approaches is to get to the place where they can think through things, figure things out for themselves, to the place where they don't need us. But that was their question, as to whether or not students could actually do that for themselves after they had experienced something more than an IBL type. I thought that was a good question for them to, and it suggested to me that they were beginning to get a sense of what we were trying to do with this. I asked a few structure questions. One of them was how much context is needed, because I did admit when we were talking that there were times in my classes when I did some talking. But I suggested that I did the talking in order to set a context. Now, context is pretty easy for us in mathematics because we've got axioms and definitions and things that we then follow up, and it's nice sequential. That's not always the case, of course, in some of these other disciplines, and they observe that as well. In those questions that I call structure questions, I also asked about what materials were needed. And when I said I teach courses in which I have no textbook whatsoever, I teach a course, which is a cross-disciplinary thing with philosophy, in which I say to the students, you can, although there's going to be a book that they're going to look at, that you cannot read out of this book until I tell you you can. That's a rule for the course. And when I said that as an example, I got a, what? How can that possibly work? So there's a mindset that's there in terms of these students can't think about things without reference to something that the experts have already told them. And so we had a nice discussion in terms of use of books or non-use of books. And it's pretty clear to me from some of the comments at the end of the day on the side that people had never, most of these people, or practically all of them, had never conceived of having the students think through something themselves, and then read, which is what I do in that course, to see what other people have said, rather than the other way around. They think in terms of having to read first. I asked for us to collectively make a list of the role or roles that a teacher has. And you can guess what the first thing was: to supply information to the students. And I said, take that one out, what else? Right. And we had the kind of lecture versus discussion versus non-lecture. And I claim, and still do, that the best courses I've ever taught are ones in which I said less. That the best courses I've ever taught, and you probably too, John, are the ones where I had said very little. And that whole distinction between that and how controlling a teacher was within the discussion brought forth, I think, probably the distinction between IBL type approaches and more traditional lecture approaches than anything else that we did all day. Here's the question, and this is actually a question I led them to come up to, that we sort of ended that with, and the question was, what could students accomplish in absence of teachers? I don't know how many of you all do it, but for certain classes, if they're not doing what I want to, there'll be days when I walk out and leave them alone on purpose, and with the challenge to get something done. The idea being, it's you, not me. That was an idea or a notion that no one, at least in that group, had conceived of. Also asked the question of what was expected and required of students in class and also between classes. And I got the standard answers. Between classes, they're reading assignments, they're writing assignments, there's the standard kind of homework. And in class, the two answers I got immediately were attentiveness and responsiveness. And I said, what about the students doing presentations? And no one suggested that as a regular activity, but probably I had some converts in terms of that being more of what happens in classes after the discussion. Now, there are lots of other things I did, but let me skip over to a couple of things since I want to make sure there's time. One of the other things I did in preparation for this is I went and talked to some of my colleagues in other disciplines to see if I could find anything that was IBL type in what they did. Now, Guilford is one of these small liberal arts colleges, and we have very few lecturers on our faculty. So I find things of that type. I'd like to share one particular example that a few years ago I was in charge of coordinating reviews of tenured faculty. And so I went and sat in colleagues' classes and saw what they did. During that time, a long-term colleague of mine who teaches accounting, I thought, I got to go sit in accounting classes. What in the world is going to happen there? I saw one of the best examples I've ever seen of something that I feel like is inquiry-based. My colleague's name's Garland Granger, and I talked to him afterwards. He'd never heard of IBL. He didn't know what I was talking about, but he used it. He walked into the class and he said, we have to come up with a way to account for this. I don't even remember what the topic was, but something in financial accounting. This is intermediate accounting now. And he said to the students, how would you do that? Now, they've had a year already. How would you do that? And he left them alone, and they figured it out, and they came back, and here's the way we do that. And then what Garland did is he went and he said, here's what FASB, that's the Federal Accounting Standards Board, says you should do with this. Guess what? Wasn't anything like what the students came up with. So then the next question, which is probably the question that all of us use more than any other thing, is why would there be a difference? And he thinks that the students get a better understanding of what's going on in development of accounting principles from those kind of exercises than anything else. He says they have to be very careful with it because sometimes they want to, when they take the test for CPA and all of those things, they want to come up with the ones that make sense to them, not the ones that are actual standards. I used that example down at Murray State in the workshop, and afterwards I had a faculty in the nursing school come up and say, I can do that with what we call protocols. Exactly that. And so I know that there were a few of the people in the group who began to get an idea that the traditional ways of teaching, there are other alternatives. I even had one who came and said, I'm a terrible lecturer, I really like this. And so I would encourage two things. If you get an opportunity to talk with people outside of mathematics about what they do in the classroom, to look for those kinds of things that have a real kinship with what we do. And I will tell you this, I don't know whether people at Murray State got a whole lot out of the workshop. I think some of them did. But I know I got a whole lot out of it because I had to think about this stuff other than within mathematics. I'd be glad to respond to any comments or questions if anybody's got any.